Designated Substances Training. Agenda. What is a designated substance? Ontario Regulation 490-09. Identifying designated substances and their hazards. Roles and responsibilities. Asbestos, lead, silica, and mercury. Controls. What is a designated substance? Designated substances are substances that have been targeted for special regulation by the Ministry of Labor. Generally, these substances are well-known toxic materials which present serious risk of illness. The Occupational Health and Safety Act requires that owners notify contractors of the presence of any designated substance. Contractors also have a responsibility to advise subcontractors. Prior to a construction project commencing, the contractors and workers are required to be notified of any designated substances. Ontario Regulation 490-09 Designated Substances. This training module will touch upon the 4 most common designated substances found on construction sites. If you have questions involving any of the other substances, please contact the Health and Safety Department. Identifying. Designated substances are especially dangerous when adequate controls are not put in place to protect workers. On a construction site, the project owner is legally required to identify any designated substances and inventory them. This list must be supplied to contractors as part of the bidding process and before any contracts are finalized. Designated substances potentially found on construction sites. Asbestos. Common locations. Insulation, wallboard, asphalt, adhesives, caulking, ceiling and floor tiles, gaskets, drywall compound, plaster, and roof shingles. Isocyanates. Spray foam insulation, sealants, finishes, paint, and auto body materials. Lead. Old paint, old motor, old water pipes, leak sheeting, and contaminated soil. Mercury. Fluorescent lights, switches, pressure gauges, electrodes, and contaminated soil. Silica. Bricks and blocks, granite, abrasives, concrete, sandstone, cement, and mortar. Dangers of exposure. Exposure to designated substances can cause cancer, strong allergic reactions, liver and lung disorders, and damage to the nervous system. However, the signs are not always immediate or obvious. Sometimes it can take years or even decades before the symptoms of a disease or disorder appear. Factors such as genetics, allergies, pre-existing conditions, lifestyle, and age can affect how quickly the effects of exposure can be seen or felt. Management responsibilities. Management responsible for the workplace determines if a designated substance is present, processed, produced, used, handled, or stored in the workplace. If a designated substance is present in the workplace, the manager responsible makes an assessment as outlined in the specific regulation in consultation with the Joint Health and Safety Committee. Hazard assessment. The assessment determines if workers are likely to be exposed to a designated substance by inhalation, ingestion, or absorption and takes into account such matters as the methods and procedures used in the processing, use, handling, or storage of a designated substance, the extent and potential extent of exposure of a worker through inhalation, ingestion, or absorption of a designated substance, the procedures necessary to control such exposure by means of engineering controls, work practices, and personal hygiene facilities and practices. Controls. A copy of the designated substance assessment will be provided to each member of the Joint Health and Safety Committee. When a designated substance control program is necessary, the contractor develops the control program in consultation with the Joint Health and Safety Committee and includes provisions for engineering controls, work practices, hygiene practices and facilities, monitoring methods and procedures, medical surveillance, records of medical surveillance, training programs. Asbestos. Asbestos is a naturally occurring mineral composed of soft and flexible fibers that are resistant to heat, electricity, and corrosion. These qualities make the mineral useful, but they also make asbestos exposure highly toxic. Asbestos is an effective insulator and it can be used in cloth, paper, cement, plastic, and other materials to make them stronger. But when asbestos dust is inhaled or ingested, mineral fibers can become permanently trapped in the body. GRASCAN shall cause an assessment to be made in writing of the exposure or likelihood of exposure of a worker to the inhalation or ingestion of asbestos. GRASCAN will consider and take into account such matters as the methods and procedures used or to be used in the processing, mining, use, handling, or storage of asbestos. GRASCAN will also consider the extent and potential extent of the exposure of a worker to the inhalation or ingestion of asbestos, and the measures and procedures necessary to control such exposure by any means of engineering controls, work practices, and hygiene practices and facilities. Asbestos health effects. GrassCan will ensure that workers who are likely to be employed in an asbestos process or are likely to be exposed to asbestos dust are warned that inhalation of asbestos may cause pneumoconiosis, lung cancer, or mesothelioma, and the risk of injury to health caused by the inhalation of asbestos is increased by smoking. Are outfitted with appropriate PPE to limit hazards associated with asbestos exposure. Working with asbestos. Working with asbestos is categorized into three categories: high-risk asbestos process, medium-risk asbestos process, and low-risk asbestos process. For high-risk process, no worker is permitted to enter the area where the asbestos process was carried out without an approved respiratory protective device until a competent person determines there are no visible signs of debris in that area, and air monitoring verifies that airborne asbestos fiber concentrations are less than 0.01 fibers per cubic centimeter of air. There are no exceptions to this requirement. Responsibilities. GrassCan shall, in consultation with the committee, develop an asbestos control plan that protects the health and safety of all workers in the event of dispersal of asbestos dust into the atmosphere at a place of employment or worksite. A plan developed must be in writing and include emergency procedures to be used in case of uncontrolled release of asbestos, including Asbestos Control Plan, the means to protect exposed workers, methods to confine and control the release of asbestos, and the decontamination procedures to be used. The asbestos process that workers may undertake, the training of workers in any asbestos process the workers may be required or permitted to undertake, the methods to control the release of asbestos, the PPE workers may be required to use, decontamination procedure, and the inspection and maintenance schedule for all asbestos-containing materials. Lead. Lead. For years, lead was used in a variety of ways throughout the building and construction industry, from plumbing pipes supplying drinking water from source to faucets, to lead-based paint being used to paint both vehicles and structures alike. Even though lead is no longer used, traces can still be found throughout the construction industry. More common forms are contaminated ground soils from corroded lead pipe, lead dust from paint flakes, lead particles from grinding disturbing of lead pipes, lead fumes from torch cutting or heating of lead pipes. Entering your system. Lead can enter the body in two main ways: inhalation and ingestion. It may be inhaled when it is burned or melted, releasing some of the lead as a fume, or be inhaled when dust containing lead becomes airborne. It may also be ingested when cigarettes, food, or food preparation surfaces become contaminated by lead-containing dust, or ingested by contaminated drinking water. Lead health effects. GrassCan will ensure that workers who are likely to be exposed to lead dust are warned that inhalation of lead may cause various forms of ailment, including various forms of cancer, which will be hazardous to health and may lead to death. The potential for worker exposure to lead should be identified during the hazard assessment. If lead is suspected to be on the job site, GrassCan shall cause an assessment to be made in writing of the exposure or likelihood of exposure of a worker to the inhalation or ingestion of lead. Responsibilities. GrassCan will take all necessary measures and procedures to reduce the exposure to the worker. This is done by means of engineering controls, work and hygiene practices, and facilities to ensure that the time-weighted average exposure of a worker to airborne lead particulates or dust is reduced. To ensure that a worker's exposure to lead is kept as low as reasonably achievable, and in any case, employees must not be exposed to airborne concentrations of lead in excess of 0.05 mgm3 as TWA exposure limit set by Reg 833 of the OHSA. Atmospheric testing results should be assessed before a worker is exposed. Controls. GrassCan will consider the methods and procedures used or to be used in the processing, mining, and disposal of lead, the extent and potential extent of the exposure of a worker to the inhalation or ingestion of lead, the measures and procedures necessary to control such exposure by means of engineering controls, work practices, and hygiene practices, and facilities. Silica. Silica. Crystalline silica is a common mineral found in the Earth's crust. Materials like sand, stone, concrete, and mortar contains crystalline silica. It is also used to make products such as glass, pottery, ceramics, bricks, and artificial stone. Cutting, chipping, grinding, and drilling these materials creates a lot of dust, which contains tiny crystalline silica particles. Silica health effects. GrassCan will ensure that workers who are likely to be exposed to silica dust are warned that the inhalation of silica may cause various forms of silicosis, which can be hazardous to health and may lead to death. This airborne silica dust can easily be breathed in, causing a major health hazard for exposed workers. Crystalline silica has been classified as a human lung carcinogen and can cause serious lung disease and lung cancer. It only takes a very small amount of respirable silica dust to create a health hazard and potentially lead to the serious silicosis disease. Responsibilities. GRASSCAN shall cause an assessment to be made in writing of the exposure or likelihood of exposure of a worker to the inhalation or ingestion of silica and take into account such as matters as the methods and procedures used in processing, mining, and disposal of silica, the extent and potential extent of the exposure of a worker to the inhalation or ingestion of silica, the measures and procedures necessary to control such exposure by means of engineering control, work practices, and hygiene practices and facilities. Controls. GRASSCAN will take all necessary measures and procedures to reduce the exposure to the worker by any means of engineering controls, work and hygiene practices, and facilities to ensure that the time-weighted average exposure of a worker to airborne silica is reduced. To ensure that a worker's exposure to silica is kept as low as reasonably achievable, and in any case, employees must not be exposed to airborne concentrations of silica in excess of in quartz 0.1 mgm3 silica fiber concentrations are less than 0.05 of fibers per cubic meter of air. In crystal bolite 0.10 mgm3 silica fiber concentrations are less than 0.10 of fibers per cubic meter of air. Above TWA exposure limits set by Reg 833 of the OHSA. Atmospheric testing results should be assessed before a worker is exposed. Respiratory and PPE. The use of approved respirators shall be at no cost to the employees and will be used in conjunction with work practice controls, work operations to reduce exposure, and in emergencies. GRASSCAN Construction shall provide workers with respiratory equipment which shall be used by the workers in the instances where an emergency exists or the measures and procedures necessary to control the exposure of a worker to an airborne designated substance do not exist or are unavailable, are not reasonable or practical for the length of the time or frequency of exposure or the nature of the process, operation, or work, are not effective because of a temporary breakdown of equipment. Mercury. Mercury. Mercury is naturally occurring metal. At normal temperatures, it is a shiny silver-white odorless liquid. When heated, mercury becomes a colorless, odorless gas. Mercury is used to produce caustic soda and was also used in thermometers, fluorescent light fixtures, which we come across on site occasionally. The central nervous system is very sensitive to all forms of mercury. However, vapor is especially harmful because it can directly reach the brain. Mercury health effects. Exposure to high levels of mercury can permanently damage the brain, kidneys, and developing fetus. Short-term exposure may cause lung damage, nausea, vomiting, skin rashes, and eye irritation. Mercury can be found in some lab equipment such as thermometers, manometers, medical equipment such as blood pressure cuffs, thermostats, fluorescent light fixtures, etc. For further information or direction, please contact the Health and Safety Department at 416-213-8766 extension 2.